Like my cat? In this video, I want to talk about a few stories that use biblical characters, but they're stories that are mythological. They're not, nobody believes in them, but I mean, when you have the biblical stories, there are people who believe in them, there are people who don't, there are people who believe in some of them, there are people who don't believe in some of them. However, there's a lot of myths and legends out there that have come down to us through the years that use biblical characters to tell more stories. For example, a person I know told me once that in Jewish folktale, the most commonly used person from the Old Testament is actually Elijah, the prophet. I'm not going to mention him in any of these stories, but that was interesting that I didn't know that fact. But basically, there's a lot of stories out there that aren't meant to be believed in literally, but they're stories that use biblical characters. And I want to talk a little bit about a few of them here. I mentioned in my video on Near Eastern mythology, I mentioned it briefly about Lilith. Lilith is a very interesting figure because her name sometimes is Lilith rather than Lilith, and she is actually described as the first wife of Adam before Eve, but it didn't work out. Basically, because they didn't get along, she felt like she didn't want to. He's the man. He's supposed to have dominion over her, and she wasn't going to stand for that. Sexually speaking, she was like, "Hey, why do you always get to be on top?" And he said, "Well, because I'm the man." And she wouldn't stand for that, so she flew off, and she started producing many demons. She became a demoness herself, and she started producing demons. She was chased. God sent after her angels to try and make her stop and to try and bring her back. And they threatened her. They said, "We're going to kill your children if you don't listen to us and if you don't listen to God." And she said, "Well, I don't care. I'm not going to listen to you." So they killed her children. And this is why people throughout the centuries, Jewish mothers are very much afraid for their children, because as a form of revenge, Lilith is known as a demoness that goes around hurting children. So there are these amulets that are believed to have been given to newborn babies to protect them from Lilith. So that's an interesting story. You've heard of giants in the Old Testament. The most famous giant, of course, is Goliath. And of course, we know the story of David and Goliath. But there are other giants as well. For example, there's a giant by the name of Og, who is believed to have helped Noah. According to some stories, Og tried to, while the ark is floating on the waters, he actually helped keep it afloat from sinking, because he was so big he was able to swim alongside the ark and hold it aloft. Later on, when he became evil, he was killed by Moses, of all people. There's also a very interesting story that is referred to in Genesis. Genesis, just prior to the flood myth, Genesis mentions very briefly the story of these sons of God. They're believed to be angels, and they looked upon the daughters of men, and they lusted after them, and they came down from heaven and had sex with them. And because of that, they gave birth to these great men that were also described sometimes as giants. However, these giants brought evil into the world, and then everybody became evil, and then God got fed up with humanity and flooded the earth. Usually you hear about the evil of men prior to the flood, but you usually don't hear much about this interesting story about these sons of God lusting after mortal women and giving rise to a breed of giants. This is actually lengthened in other in other stories. For example, the Book of Enoch, which is not in the Bible, it's a extra biblical story. This story is really laid out, and it's fleshed out, and it's made more elaborate. These sons of God, which are believed to be angels, had a leader, and they came down from heaven and slept with various women. And not only did they sleep with them and produce this brood of giants, but they taught them magic. Anything magical is not really good. It's seen as against God. So they taught them magic, and they taught them how to make armor and weapons. So they kind of taught war. And of all things, horror upon horrors, they taught the women cosmetics. Yeah, they taught them how to paint their faces, which is a really bad thing. And God got so mad, evil was brought into the world, that he sent down Michael and Raphael to imprison the leader of these angels that slept with women. Sometimes he's called, I forget if it's Azazoth or Azazel. I'm not exactly sure. I have to look it up. And they also slew the giants that were their children, but from the bodies of the dead giants came demons. So evil came into the world. This is all very interesting because not only does it flesh out this interesting story of how evil came into the world, but it also seems to give an alternative opinion as to the origins of the revolt against God. We're all more familiar with the story about how Lucifer wanted to be like God, and he wants to, he rebelled against God, and so the angels were thrown out of heaven because they fought against God, and the fallen angels are the demons, basically. And apparently this all happened before humans were created, because by the time Adam and Eve were created, the serpent came into the garden, and the serpent is supposedly the devil, But this story of the Watchers, the story of the Watchers, as it's sometimes called, the angels that came down from heaven to sleep with mortal women, apparently happened much after humanity was created, because there were a lot of people around, and there were a lot of men and women, and there were a lot of beautiful women for these angels to lust after and sleep with, and produce children that were giants. And they had a leader, and he was imprisoned until the judgment, just like you hear about the devil. So this is very interesting. It's sort of an alternative version to the origins of evil and the revolt against God, and the origins of of magic and war and weapons and cosmetics. Moving on to another story, moving into from the Old Testament into the New Testament. It's a very interesting story about another thing having to do with magic. Okay, the New Testament mentions a character by the name of Simon Magus. Magus meaning he was a magician. Now in the New Testament he's mentioned rather briefly, but there's a myth that grew up about him. Where now you got to remember, I got to backtrack for a minute. We get the word simony from Simon, because when Simon is introduced in the New Testament, he sees Peter and Paul, and no, not Paul, sorry. He sees Peter performing miracles and healing people, and he gets in his mind that this isn't through the grace of God and by faith. He thinks it's magical and something that could be taught. So he is condemned for simony, because this idea that healing people and doing miracles is a form of magic that could be taught, and it's not. That's what's meant by simony. It's not something that could be taught. It's something that you develop by having, love of God and having the miracles flow through you from God. In the stories that grew up around Simon Magus, he's made into this great magician, and he has a magical war with Peter, and he wants to prove to the Emperor of Rome that he's a greater magician. So what he decides to do is he decides to fly, and he really could fly. He's able to come off the ground, and he's flying all around the city of Rome, and the Roman Emperor is looking up and saying, "Holy crap, this guy can really fly. He is a really good magician." But Peter knows that whenever you do magic, you're really invoking the help of demons. I'm not saying I believe that necessarily, but but according to biblical sources and biblical literature and stuff like that, magic usually is believed to be demonic. And so Peter sees the demons, even though nobody else can see them. He sees the demons holding up Simon Magus. So he starts praying. So when the demons hear prayer, oh, they got to run away. Oh my God, somebody's praying. We got to flee. So they flee, and Simon Magus is no longer held into the air, and he falls and he dies. And that's the end of Simon Magus. This, of course, is not in the Bible. This is outside the Bible. One of the many stories having to do with Simon Magus. There are many other very, very interesting stories outside the Bible. There's other stories that take up too much time to go into detail. But if you're interested, I have two books here that are really nice. I'm going to mention these books in the description. There's two books I have here that talk about legends outside of the Bible. For Old Testament, you've got this book called Jewish Legends by David Goldstein, and this book Christian Legends by George Every. And they're both published by Library of the World's Myths and Legends. I first came across the story of the Watchers, which is the very interesting story about how magic was introduced into the world and cosmetics was introduced into the world by these sons of God that lusted after women. This is actually from the Book of Enoch, but I didn't read it directly from the Book of Enoch. I first came across it from this story, from this book called The Black Arts by Richard Cavendish. This is a great little book if you're interested in the history of magic and the occult. I'm not saying you should go out and start conjuring demons. I just think, if you're interested in just the history of things like that, this is a great book to start with, The Black Arts. Okay, so that's it for this video. I'm going to say goodbye with my black cat here. We're going to conjure some demons later. I'm just kidding. We're not going to do that. I actually don't believe in magic. But anyway, so until next time.